I stood at the altar in a soft gray suit that still smelled faintly of the tailor's steam press, my hand resting in Elias's palm. His thumb moved in slow circles against my knuckles, a rhythm he always used to calm me. The chapel was small, perched on a bluff overlooking the Pacific, and through the stained glass windows the morning light filtered in pale shades of amber and rose. Outside, I could hear the waves rolling against the rocks, steady and indifferent to the ceremony unfolding inside. The officiant was speaking. I heard fragments of her words: love, commitment, the journey we were choosing together, but my mind kept drifting. I wanted to be present. I wanted to feel the weight of this moment fully, to let it settle into my bones the way it should. But my eyes kept returning to the second row, to the empty chair with the linen program resting on its seat, untouched. The breeze from the half-open door caught the edge of the paper, and it fluttered once before going still again. That chair was supposed to be his. Elias squeezed my hand gently, pulling me back. I looked at him then, at the softness in his face, the way he was watching me with that quiet understanding he always carried. He knew where my thoughts had gone. He didn't say anything, but his expression told me it was okay, that I could be here and somewhere else at the same time. That grief and joy didn't have to be separate. When the officiant asked us to exchange our vows, I spoke the words I had written months earlier. I meant every one of them. But even as I said them, even as Elias's eyes filled with tears and the small gathering of friends behind us smiled and nodded, I felt the absence like a cold draft moving through the room. My father's silence was louder than any words I spoke that day. Afterward, when we walked down the short aisle together as husbands, I heard the violinist begin a soft melody. People clapped. Someone laughed. The moment should have felt full. But all I could think about was how I had checked my phone that morning before getting dressed, hoping for a message that never came. Just one sentence would have been enough. Even an excuse. Even a lie. We stepped outside into the cool coastal air, and everyone gathered on the stone terrace for photographs. Elias's hand found mine again, and we posed beneath an arbor wrapped in ivy and white roses. The photographer asked us to look at each other, to smile, to lean in close. I did my best, but when she showed us the preview on her camera screen, I could see it in my own eyes, the heaviness I was trying to hide. Later, after the toasts and the cake and the small dinner by candlelight, I told Elias I needed a moment alone. He nodded without hesitation. He always knew when to hold on and when to let go. I walked down to the pier that stretched out over the water. The sun had begun to set, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. I stood at the edge and looked out at the horizon, the wedding ring still new and unfamiliar on my finger. It felt heavier than I expected. Not in a bad way, just heavier. I took out my phone and opened my messages. Still nothing. No missed calls. No voicemails. Just the same silence that had stretched between us for years. I scrolled up to the last message I had sent him months ago, with the wedding details and a photo of me and Elias at the coast. I had written something simple, something careful. I told him I hoped he could be there, that it would mean everything to me, that I understood if he couldn't. He never responded to that message. The reply came later, by mail. A single sheet of paper with his handwriting, stiff and careful. I could still see the words clearly in my mind. I can't come, Julian. I'm sorry. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and stood there listening to the water below, to the gulls circling overhead, to the distant sound of laughter from the terrace behind me. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. And in so many ways, it was. Elias was everything I had ever wanted. Kind, patient, steady. He loved me in a way I didn't know I deserved. But standing there on that pier, with the sky turning dark and the wind picking up across the water, I realized something I had been avoiding for a long time. Love and loss weren't opposites. They lived together, tangled and inseparable. And no matter how much joy I found, there would always be a part of me waiting for my father to show up, to see me, to try. I heard footsteps behind me. Elias appeared at my side, still in his navy suit, his tie loosened. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just stood there with me, his shoulder brushing mine, both of us looking out at the sea and the fading light. He said my name softly, Julian. I turned to him, and he pulled me into his arms without another word. I rested my head against his chest and felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath the fabric. And for a moment, I let myself believe that us, together, holding each other against the ache of everything missing, was enough. That night, in the small Airbnb overlooking the water, I couldn't sleep. Elias lay beside me, his breathing slow and even, one arm draped across my waist. The room was dark except for the moonlight spilling through the curtains, casting pale shadows across the wooden floor. I listened to the waves outside, their rhythm both soothing and relentless, like a heartbeat I couldn't escape. I slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake him, and opened my laptop on the small desk by the window. The screen glowed blue in the darkness. I clicked through my folders until I found what I was looking for, the email drafts folder. The letter I had written to my father months ago, the one I had revised a dozen times before finally sending. I read it again, even though I knew every word by heart. It was restrained, polite, hopeful in a way that now felt naive. I had told him about Elias, about how we met, about the life we were building together. I had invited him to be part of it. I had left the door open, even though I knew how easily he could close it. And he had. I scrolled down to his reply, the one that had arrived weeks later. Brief. Final. I can't come, Julian. I wish you both well. But I can't stand in that place and pretend I understand. I stared at those words until they blurred. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to feel the sharp heat of betrayal, the clarity that comes with righteous hurt. But all I felt was tired. Tired of hoping. Tired of waiting for a man who had never learned how to love me out loud. Behind me, I heard Elias stir. The bed creaked softly as he sat up. Julian, he said, his voice thick with sleep. Come back to bed. I closed the laptop and turned to face him. He was silhouetted against the window, his hair mussed, his eyes still half closed. Even in the darkness, I could see the concern on his face. I whispered that I was sorry, that I didn't mean to wake him. He shook his head and held out his hand. You don't have to apologize. Just come here. I crossed the room and climbed back into bed beside him. He pulled me close, wrapping both arms around me, and I pressed my face against his shoulder. We lay there in silence for a long time, the sound of the ocean filling the spaces between our breaths. He said something then, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. He's the one missing out, Julian. Not you. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to let those words settle into the hollow place inside me and fill it with something other than grief. But all I could do was hold on tighter, my fingers clutching the fabric of his shirt, and whisper into the darkness that I knew, that I understood, but understanding didn't make it hurt any less. To understand why that empty chair mattered so much, you have to understand what my life looked like before the wedding, before Elias, before I allowed myself to imagine that love could be something other than duty and silence. I was a literature professor at a mid-sized university in Portland. My office was on the third floor of an old brick building, with tall windows that overlooked a courtyard where students gathered between classes. I taught courses on contemporary fiction, on poetry, on the ways writers try to make sense of grief and longing. My students seemed to like me. They said I was patient, thoughtful, that I made difficult texts feel accessible. What they didn't know was that I found it easier to talk about other people's emotions than my own. My apartment was small but filled with light. Books lined every wall, stacked on shelves and piled beside the couch. I had a reading chair by the window where I spent most evenings, a mug of tea cooling on the side table, the rain tapping against the glass. It was a quiet life, a careful one. I told myself I was content, and then I met Elias. It was at a photography workshop I had signed up for on a whim. I had been feeling restless, like I needed to do something with my hands that wasn't grading papers or typing lecture notes. The workshop was held in a converted warehouse near the river, all exposed beams and concrete floors. There were maybe a dozen of us, and Elias was standing near the back when I walked in, adjusting the lens on an old film camera. He looked up as I passed, and something about his expression made me pause. It wasn't a smile exactly, just a kind of openness, like he was genuinely interested in whoever might walk through that door. He had dark hair that fell across his forehead, hands that moved with purpose, and eyes that seemed to notice everything without judgment. We didn't speak that first day, but during the second session, we ended up paired together for a critique exercise. He showed me his work, landscapes mostly, coastal scenes shot in early morning light, all mist and texture and quiet beauty. I told him they reminded me of Andrew Wyeth, of that same sense of isolation and longing. He smiled then, a real one, and said that was exactly what he was trying to capture. After class, he asked if I wanted to get coffee. I hesitated, surprised by how much I wanted to say yes. We walked to a cafe a few blocks away, and we talked for hours. About photography and literature, about the Oregon coast, about the strange comfort of rainy cities. He told me he made his living as a freelance artist, that he spent weeks at a time traveling to remote beaches and cliffsides, trying to catch light that most people never noticed. I told him about my work, about the books I loved, about how I had grown up in a small town on the coast, but hadn't been back in years. I didn't tell him why. Not yet. Our friendship grew slowly, the way good things often do. We started meeting for coffee every week, then twice a week. He invited me to gallery openings. I lent him books I thought he'd like. We took long walks through Forest Park, talking about everything and nothing, and I found myself laughing more than I had in years. It took me months to realize I had fallen in love with him. Or maybe I had known all along and was just too afraid to name it. One evening in late autumn, we were sitting on his apartment balcony, watching the sun set over the city. The air was cool, and we had wrapped ourselves in blankets, mugs of tea warming our hands. He was telling me about a new project he was starting, something about documenting the changing coastline, and I was only half listening because I was too aware of how close we were sitting, how easy it would be to reach over and touch his hand. He stopped talking mid-sentence and turned to look at me. "Julian," he said quietly, "are we going to keep pretending this is just friendship?" My heart stuttered. I opened my mouth to respond, to deflect, to make some joke that would let us both retreat to safer ground. But when I looked at him, at the gentleness in his face, at the way he was waiting without pushing, I couldn't do it. I told him I didn't know how to do this, that I had spent so long keeping parts of myself hidden that I wasn't sure I knew how to be seen. He reached over and took my hand. "Then we'll figure it out together," he said. And we did. Slowly, carefully, learning each other's rhythms and fears. Elias was patient in ways I didn't know a person could be. He never asked me to be anything other than what I was. He never made me feel like my hesitation was a burden. But there was always a shadow hanging over us, even in our happiest moments. My father, Robert Ward, was a man built from salt water and steel. He had worked as a ship mechanic in Astoria for 30 years, his hands always stained with grease, his face weathered by wind and sun. He was widowed when I was 7, after my mother died suddenly from an aneurysm. I remembered her in fragments, her laugh, the way she sang while cooking, the softness of her hand in mine. After she was gone, my father became someone else. Harder, more distant, like he had decided that feeling anything was too dangerous. He raised me alone in that house by the water. He taught me how to tie knots, how to fix engines, how to read the tide charts. But he never taught me how to talk about what hurt. Emotion, to him, was weakness. Vulnerability was indulgence. Love was something you showed through action, through duty, not through words. I learned early to keep certain parts of myself quiet, to be the son he expected, to not ask for more than he could give. When I was 17, I tried to tell him about a boy I had feelings for. We were in the garage, the air thick with the smell of oil and rust, and my father was bent over a workbench, sanding down a piece of wood. I stood in the doorway, my heart pounding, trying to find the right words. I said his name. "Dad, I need to tell you something." He didn't look up. "What is it?" I faltered. The words caught in my throat, and I realized I couldn't do it. Not like this. Not with his back turned, his hands still moving, his face hidden. So I told him it was nothing, that I just wanted to say goodnight. He nodded absently, and I left. We never spoke about it. And as the years went on, the distance between us grew. I went away to college. I called home on holidays. I came back for brief visits that felt more like obligations than reunions. He asked about my classes, about my job, about the weather in Portland. But he never asked about my life. Not really. When Elias and I had been together for 2 years, I finally told my father about him. It was during one of those stilted phone calls, and I said it as plainly as I could. I'm seeing someone. His name is Elias. We're happy. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then my father cleared his throat and said, "You don't need to tell me everything, son. Some things are better kept private." I felt something crack inside me, small but irreparable. I told him I understood, and we moved on to talking about the weather. After that, our calls became shorter, more perfunctory. He stopped asking questions altogether, and I stopped offering details. We drifted into a polite estrangement, the kind where you can go months without speaking and barely notice the absence. When Elias and I decided to get married, I wasn't sure if I should even tell him. But Elias, in his gentle way, insisted. "He's still your father, Julian. Give him the chance." So I did. And when that empty chair stared back at me during our wedding, I realized that some chances, no matter how carefully offered, are never taken. The wedding invitation became something I obsessed over for weeks. Elias and I had chosen a simple design, cream-colored cardstock with elegant script, the kind of understated beauty that felt true to who we were. But when it came time to write the personal note to my father, I found myself paralyzed. I must have started a dozen different versions. Some were formal and distant, offering him the information without expectation. Others were more vulnerable, trying to bridge the years of silence with honesty. I wrote drafts that were angry, drafts that were pleading, drafts that tried to pretend none of the hurt had ever happened. Elias found me one evening at the kitchen table, surrounded by crumpled papers, my head in my hands. He sat down beside me without saying anything, just placed his hand on my shoulder and waited. I told him I didn't know what to say, that every version felt either too much or not enough. He picked up one of the discarded drafts and read it quietly. Then he looked at me and said, "You're trying to control how he'll respond. But you can't do that, Julian. All you can do is tell him the truth and let him decide what to do with it." So I started over. This time, I kept it simple. I told him when and where the wedding would be. I told him that Elias was kind and that he made me happy. I said that I would understand if he couldn't come, but that I hoped he would, that it would mean more to me than I knew how to express. I included a photograph, one that Elias had taken of us at Cannon Beach a few months earlier. We were standing near the water, the wind catching our hair, both of us smiling. It wasn't posed or perfect. It was just us, in a moment of unguarded happiness. I hoped that seeing it might soften something in my father, that he might look at my face and see not a stranger, but his son. I sealed the envelope with trembling hands and walked it to the mailbox on the corner. For a moment, I stood there holding it, wondering if I should just tear it up and save myself the disappointment. But I thought of Elias's words, of his quiet insistence that people deserve chances even when they failed us before. So I dropped it in the slot and walked home, my chest tight with something between hope and dread. Weeks passed with no response. I checked the mail every day, sometimes twice. I told myself not to expect anything. That silence was its own kind of answer. But every time the mailbox was empty, I felt the sting of it. Elias watched me go through this ritual without comment. He knew better than to offer reassurances that might not come true. Instead, he stayed close, his presence a quiet anchor while I waited. Then one morning in early spring, I found an envelope with my father's handwriting. I stood there on the porch, staring at my name written in his careful, angular script. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no preamble, just a few lines in the center of the page. "Julian, I can't come. I wish you both well, but I can't stand in that place and pretend I understand. Dad." I read it 3 times, searching for something I might have missed. Some softness between the words, some indication that he had struggled with this decision. But there was nothing, just blunt refusal and a signature. I stood there for a long time, the letter hanging loose in my hand. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anger or surprise. I just felt tired, like I had been holding my breath for years and had finally been told I could stop. I walked inside and set the letter on the kitchen counter. Then I grabbed my jacket and went out into the morning drizzle without telling Elias where I was going. I needed to move. I needed the rain on my face and the sound of my footsteps on wet pavement. I walked through the neighborhood, past couples sharing umbrellas, past mothers pushing strollers, past a man walking his dog who smiled and wished me good morning. Everyone seemed to be part of something, connected, belonging, held by invisible threads of love and obligation. And I felt like I was watching it all from behind glass, separate and untouchable. I found myself at a small park and sat on a bench beneath an oak tree. The rain had lightened to a mist, and I watched it bead on the leaves, gathering weight before falling. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to be the son my father could accept, how I had learned to edit myself, to speak in half-truths, to keep the fullness of my life hidden so he wouldn't have to confront what made him uncomfortable. And I thought about how exhausting it was, how much energy it took to love someone who couldn't love you back in the way you needed. When I returned home, Elias was sitting by the window with a book in his lap, though I could tell he hadn't been reading. He looked up as I came in, his eyes searching my face. He didn't ask where I had been. He just set the book aside and waited. I told him about the letter. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he stood and crossed the room to where I was standing. He wrapped his arms around me and held me there in the hallway, both of us still and silent. After a while, he said softly, "He's scared, Julian. That's all this is. He's scared of what it means to accept you fully, and he's using misunderstanding as an excuse." I pulled back and looked at him. I said I didn't think it was that simple, that my father wasn't scared. He was ashamed. Ashamed of me, of who I was, of having to acknowledge it in front of other people. Elias shook his head. Shame and fear aren't that different. They both keep people locked inside themselves. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think that somewhere beneath my father's silence was something redeemable, something that could still be reached. But I had been trying to reach it my entire life, and my hands were tired. That evening, my sister Nora called from Seattle. She had received her own invitation and wanted to talk about the wedding plans. Near the end of the call, she asked carefully if I had heard from our father. I told her about the letter. There was a long pause on her end, and then she sighed. "You know how he is, Julian. He's stubborn and he's stuck in his ways. But he'll come around eventually. He always does." I didn't argue with her, but I didn't believe her either. Nora had always been better at hope than I was. She had left home earlier than I had built a life far enough away that she didn't have to carry the weight of our father's disappointment as constantly. She could afford to believe in eventual reconciliation. I couldn't. After we hung up, Elias and I sat together on the couch, his head on my shoulder, my hand in his. We didn't talk about the wedding or my father or what it meant to build a life with someone when parts of your past refused to witness it. We just sat there in the quiet, holding each other against the accumulation of small griefs. The wedding plans continued. We finalized the menu, confirmed the flowers, chose the music. Friends offered their support and their joy. People told us how beautiful the ceremony would be, how lucky we were to have found each other. And they were right. We were lucky. But there was a small voice in the back of my mind that kept asking the same question. If the person who raised you can't bear to see you happy, does the happiness count as much? I knew the answer should be yes. I knew that my father's limitations didn't define my worth or the legitimacy of my love. But knowing something and feeling it are not the same thing. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, I found myself thinking about my mother more than I had in years. I wondered what she would have said, how she would have held me, whether her love would have been big enough to cover both of us. I had so few memories of her, just fragments and impressions. But I remembered the warmth of her, the way she made our small house feel safe. And I missed her with an ache that had no language. The night before the wedding, Elias and I drove up to the coast where the ceremony would be held. We checked into the small Airbnb and walked down to the beach as the sun was setting. The sky was streaked with orange and pink, and the tide was going out, leaving dark patches of sand that reflected the light. Elias took my hand, and we walked in silence, our shoes leaving prints that the water slowly erased. I thought about tomorrow, about standing at that altar, about the empty chair that would sit in quiet accusation. And I made a decision. I would let myself feel the absence. I would let it be part of the day, instead of trying to pretend it wasn't there. Because love, I was learning, wasn't just about what you gained. It was also about what you carried and what you chose to keep carrying even when it hurt. The months after the wedding should have been the easiest of my life. We had done it. We had stood in front of the people we loved and made promises that felt both ancient and new. We had danced and laughed and cut cake and kissed beneath string lights as the sun set over the Pacific. We had begun our life together in the way we had always imagined. But something had shifted inside me that day on the pier, and I couldn't quite shift it back. Elias and I returned to Portland and fell into the rhythms of married life. We woke up together in the mornings, made coffee while still half asleep, and moved around our apartment with the easy familiarity of two people learning to share space. We cooked dinner together most nights, took weekend trips to the coast, visited galleries and bookstores and farmers markets. From the outside, everything looked exactly as it should. But there was a quiet ache between us now, something neither of us named but both of us felt. It lived in the pauses of our conversations, in the moments when I would drift away mid-sentence, in the way Elias would watch me with concern he tried to hide. The wedding had been beautiful. Our love was real. But the absence of my father had left a mark I didn't know how to heal. I started a new semester at the university in September. I taught 2 sections of American literature and a graduate seminar on contemporary poetry. My students were bright and engaged, and I found comfort in the familiar routine of lectures and office hours. But that semester, I was teaching a unit on forgiveness and literature, James Baldwin, Rainer Maria Rilke, Virginia Woolf, and the words I spoke in class began to feel hollow in my mouth. I stood at the front of the room and talked about reconciliation, about the ways writers grapple with estrangement and loss, about the possibility of grace even in the absence of resolution. My students nodded and took notes and wrote thoughtful essays about redemption and healing. But I felt like a fraud, teaching concepts I couldn't embody in my own life. One afternoon after class, a student approached me during office hours. She was writing her thesis on Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, and she wanted to talk about the scene where David reflects on his father's inability to love him. She asked me what I thought Baldwin was trying to say about fathers and sons, about the inheritance of silence. I sat there looking at her earnest face, and for a moment I couldn't speak. I thought about my own father, about the years we had spent not saying what mattered, about the wedding invitation that had been both an olive branch and a test he had failed. I thought about how much easier it was to analyze other people's pain than to sit with your own. I told her that Baldwin understood something fundamental, that love isn't always enough to bridge the distance between who we are and who our parents need us to be, that sometimes the kindest thing we can do is stop waiting for them to change. She thanked me and left, and I sat alone in my office as the autumn light faded outside my window. I felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with teaching. At home, Elias was working on a new photography series. He had received a grant to document the changing Oregon coastline, and he spent weeks traveling up and down Highway 101, capturing images of erosion and resilience, of cliffs crumbling into the sea and tide pools holding on against the waves. The work was beautiful, haunting in its attention to impermanence. Some evenings he would show me the day's shots on his laptop, and we would sit together on the couch while he narrated what he had seen. He talked about light and composition, about the way certain beaches had changed since his last visit, about the fragility of the land we loved. I listened and offered feedback, but part of me was always elsewhere, caught in thoughts I couldn't articulate. One night in October, Elias closed his laptop and turned to me. "You've been somewhere else lately," he said quietly. "And I don't think it's just work." I started to deny it, to offer some excuse about being tired or stressed about grading. But he reached over and took my hand, and the gentleness of the gesture undid me. I told him I didn't know how to stop thinking about my father, that even though months had passed since the wedding, I couldn't let go of the hurt, that I felt like I was carrying something heavy that I didn't know how to put down. Elias listened without interrupting. Then he said, "You don't have to put it down, Julian. You just have to decide if you want to keep carrying it alone." I looked at him, this man who had chosen me despite all my complications, and I realized how much I had been holding back. I had been so focused on the absence of my father that I hadn't fully let myself be present with my husband. I had been protecting myself from more disappointment by keeping part of my heart closed, even to the person who loved me most. I told him I was sorry, that I didn't mean to pull away. He shook his head. You're not pulling away. You're grieving. There's a difference. In November, I started noticing small things that reminded me of my father. The smell of coffee in the morning. He always drank it black, strong enough to strip paint. The sound of rain on the roof. He used to sit on the porch during storms, just watching the water fall. The worn flannel shirts I found at thrift stores. He had lived in shirts like that, soft from years of washing. I found myself looking at old photographs I hadn't opened in years. Pictures from my childhood, when my mother was still alive and our house felt full of possibility. There was one photo in particular that I kept returning to. I was maybe 8 years old, sitting on the dock beside my father, both of us in matching flannel shirts. We were looking out at the water, and his hand was resting on my shoulder. I didn't remember the moment being taken, but something about the image made my chest ache. We had been close once, or at least, we had been together. I showed the picture to Elias one evening. He studied it carefully, then looked at me. You look like him, he said. The way you tilt your head when you're thinking. The shape of your hands. Even the way you stand. I had never wanted to hear that before. For years, I had tried to distance myself from my father, to become someone different, someone he couldn't hurt with his silence. But Elias said it without judgment, just as an observation. And for the first time, I wondered if resembling my father wasn't something to fear, but simply a fact to accept. In late November, my sister Nora called. Her voice was careful, the way it always was when she had to deliver news she knew would upset me. She told me that our father's health had started to decline. Nothing catastrophic, she said quickly, but he had been feeling tired, short of breath. He had finally gone to the doctor, and they were running tests. Something with his lungs, maybe from all those years working in shipyards, breathing in fumes and dust. She said he had been asking about me, not directly, but in the way he always did, through indirect questions, through long pauses where my name should have been. He had asked Nora if I was doing well, if I was happy in Portland, if I was still teaching. He never said my name, but the questions hung there anyway, weighted with all the things he couldn't say. I sat with that information for days, turning it over in my mind. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, to think that maybe his declining health would force him to confront what he had lost. But mostly I just felt sad. Sad that it took illness for him to think of me. Sad that even now, his concern came filtered through my sister, unable to reach me directly. Elias asked me if I wanted to visit him. He said it gently, without pressure, just offering the possibility. I told him I didn't know, that I wasn't sure what good it would do. But the truth was, I was afraid. Afraid that if I went back to that house, I would find the same man I had always known, closed off, uncomfortable, unable to meet me where I stood. Afraid that even facing his own mortality, he wouldn't be able to say the things I had spent my whole life waiting to hear. December arrived, and with it the kind of rain that made Portland feel like it existed underwater. The days were short and gray, and I found myself sleeping more, retreating into books, losing hours to the quiet hum of rain against the windows. Elias worried, I could tell, but he gave me space while staying close enough that I knew I wasn't alone. One evening, we were making dinner together, and he was telling me about a beach he had photographed that day. He described the way the fog had rolled in over the rocks, creating layers of gray that made the landscape feel almost abstract. He was excited, animated in the way he got when his work was going well. I listened, chopping vegetables, and something about the domesticity of the moment, the warm kitchen, the smell of garlic and olive oil, the sound of my husband's voice, made me realize how much I had been given. How Elias had built a life with me that was steady and kind, even when I brought my grief to the table every night. I set down the knife and turned to him. He stopped mid-sentence, sensing the shift. I told him I was grateful, that I knew I hadn't been easy to live with lately, but that I saw him, that I saw what he was doing, how he was holding us both together while I figured out how to heal. He crossed the small kitchen and pulled me into his arms. We stood there for a long time, holding each other while the rice simmered on the stove and the rain continued its steady percussion outside. Later that night, After we had eaten and cleaned up and settled onto the couch with tea, Elias asked me again about my father. Not if I wanted to visit, but what I was afraid would happen if I did. I thought about it carefully before answering. I told him I was afraid that nothing would change, that I would drive all the way to Astoria, sit in that house that still smelled like sawdust and salt, and find that the distance between us was still too vast to cross. That all my hope would curdle into confirmation that some things can't be fixed. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that stayed with me. Sometimes you don't go back to fix things. You go back to see them clearly. And maybe that's enough. I looked at him, at this person who understood me better than I understood myself, and I realized he was right. I had been waiting for reconciliation, for some dramatic moment of recognition and forgiveness. But maybe what I needed wasn't my father's transformation. Maybe I just needed to see him as he was, flawed and limited and human, and decide if I could make peace with that. The ocean, I realized, had been calling me back for months. Not just the place, but everything it represented, my childhood, my father, the weight of all the years I had spent trying to be enough for someone who didn't know how to receive me. And maybe it was time to answer that call. Not because I expected anything to change, but because I needed to see for myself what remained. I drove to Astoria on a gray afternoon in mid-December, the highway slick with rain, the Douglas firs rising like sentinels on either side of the road. Elias had offered to come with me, but I told him I needed to do this alone. He understood. He always understood. The drive took just under 2 hours, but it felt longer, each mile pulling me deeper into a past I had spent years trying to leave behind. I listened to the rhythm of the windshield wipers, the hiss of tires on wet pavement, and tried not to think too hard about what I would say when I arrived. The house looked smaller than I remembered. It sat at the end of a gravel road, weathered gray siding and a sagging front porch, surrounded by tall grass that had gone brown for the winter. My father's truck was parked in the driveway, rust creeping up the wheel wells. Everything looked tired, like it had been holding its breath for too long. I sat in my car for a few minutes, staring at the front door, gathering courage. Then I stepped out into the cold air and walked up the porch steps. The wood creaked under my weight, familiar and accusing. I knocked. Footsteps inside, slow and deliberate. Then the door opened, and there he was. Robert Ward looked older than I expected. Thinner. His face was more lined, his shoulders slightly hunched. But his eyes were the same, pale blue, guarded, carrying decades of things unsaid. He stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Finally, he stepped back and gestured for me to come in. "Julian," he said, his voice rougher than I remembered. I walked past him into the house that had raised me. It smelled exactly the same, cedar and dust, old coffee, the faint tang of motor oil that never quite left his clothes. The living room was dim, curtains half drawn, newspapers stacked on the coffee table. Everything was in its place, frozen in time, like the house itself was waiting for something that would never arrive. He asked if I wanted coffee. I said yes, even though I didn't, just to have something to do with my hands. He moved slowly to the kitchen, and I heard the familiar sounds of the kettle being filled, the cabinet opening, the clink of mugs. I stood in the living room, looking at everything and nothing, my heart beating too fast. When he returned, he handed me a mug and sat down in his worn armchair. I took the couch across from him, the same couch I had sat on as a child, doing homework while he listened to the radio. We sipped our coffee in silence, the distance between us measured in feet, but feeling infinite. He asked how I was doing. I told him work was good, that Portland was rainy as always, that Elias and I were settling into married life. My voice sounded strange to me, too formal, like I was reporting facts to a stranger. He nodded slowly, not quite meeting my eyes. "That's good," he said. "That's real good." More silence. I looked around the room, searching for something to anchor myself to. My eyes landed on the mantel above the fireplace, and I noticed something I hadn't seen when I first walked in, a photograph in a simple frame. I stood and crossed the room to look closer. It was my mother, young, maybe in her early 20s, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. They were both smiling, relaxed, their arms around each other's shoulders. I picked up the frame carefully. "Who is this?" I asked. My father shifted in his chair. "Your mother's cousin, David. They were close growing up." I studied the photo more carefully. There was something in the way they stood together, something in their expressions that spoke of deep familiarity. I set the frame back down and turned to look at my father. His face had changed, softened somehow, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years: vulnerability. I sat back down, the question I didn't know how to ask hanging between us. That night, I told him I would stay at a motel in town, but he insisted I take my old room. It was just as I had left it, the same narrow bed, the same blue curtains, posters I had hung as a teenager still clinging to the walls. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the house settle, to my father moving around downstairs, and I felt like I had stepped into a memory that hadn't finished playing out. I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I got up and went to the kitchen for water. The house was dark except for a light coming from the back porch. I looked through the window and saw my father sitting outside in his jacket, a blanket across his lap, staring out at the darkness where the yard met the woods. I grabbed my own jacket and stepped outside. The air was cold and damp, carrying the smell of salt from the ocean a few miles away. He didn't turn when I approached, but he shifted slightly, making room. I sat down beside him on the wooden bench. We didn't speak for a long time, just sat there together in the mist that rolled in over the grass, blurring the edges of everything. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't come to your wedding," he said, his voice low and rough. "Not because I hate you, Julian. I hope you know that." I waited, my hands pressed together between my knees. "When your mother died," he continued, "I stopped letting myself feel things that hurt too much. It was easier that way, safer. And when you told me about Elias, when you invited me to stand there and watch you marry him, I thought." He stopped, his breath catching. I glanced over and saw his jaw working, struggling. I thought if I started feeling again, really feeling, I might break. I might not be able to hold it together anymore. I stared out into the darkness, my chest tight. This was more than he had said to me in years, more honesty than I knew he possessed. I asked him quietly what he meant. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Your mother had people she loved before me. People she couldn't be with because of the times we lived in, because of what people would say. She told me once, late at night, about someone she had to let go. It broke something in her, and I saw it. I saw how much it cost her to hide parts of herself." I turned to look at him fully now, my heart pounding. "When you told me about Elias," he said, his voice shaking, "all I could think about was her. About what she lost. About how the world made her smaller than she should have been. And I was scared that I had done the same thing to you. That by not knowing how to accept you, I had become one of the people who made her hurt." The confession hung in the cold air between us, raw and unpolished. For the first time, I saw my father not as the man who had rejected me, but as someone who had been carrying his own grief and fear for so long that he had forgotten how to put it down. I told him quietly that I wished he had said this sooner, that I had spent so many years thinking he was ashamed of me. He shook his head, and when he spoke again, his voice broke. "I was never ashamed of you, son. I was ashamed of myself, for not being brave enough to love you the way you deserve." We sat there in the silence that followed, both of us undone. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't reconciliation in any clean or complete way, but it was understanding, finally, after all these years. It was seeing each other as we actually were. Two people who had loved imperfectly, who had hurt each other through silence and fear, but who were still, somehow, father and son. I don't know how long we sat there. Long enough for the mist to thicken into fog. Long enough for the cold to seep through our jackets. Long enough for something between us to shift, just slightly, like a door that had been closed for decades finally opening a crack. When we finally went back inside, my father paused at the bottom of the stairs. He looked at me, his eyes wet, and said simply, "I'm glad you came." I nodded, not trusting my voice. And then I climbed the stairs to my old room and lay awake until dawn, holding this new knowledge carefully, like something fragile that might break if I examined it too closely. The months that followed my visit to Astoria brought a change I hadn't expected. My father's health continued to decline, slowly at first, then with more urgency. The test came back showing scarring in his lungs, damage from decades of breathing in shipyard fumes and coastal damp. The doctors used words like chronic and progressive, and my sister Nora started calling more frequently with updates. I drove to see him more often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Elias. Each visit felt like learning a language I had forgotten, relearning how to be in the same room with my father without the weight of decades pressing down on us. It was Elias who suggested he come with me one weekend in February. I had been hesitant, unsure how my father would react to having both of us there together. But Elias said gently that if things were going to be different, they needed to actually be different. Not just in words spoken late at night on a porch, but in the daylight, in the ordinary moments of sitting together. So we drove up together on a Saturday morning, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. My father met us at the door, and I watched as he and Elias shook hands, stiff at first, formal, but without the hostility I had feared. My father invited us in, and we sat in the living room with coffee, the three of us navigating the unfamiliar territory of being together. Elias had brought his laptop, and after a while, he asked if my father wanted to see some of his recent work. I held my breath, waiting for my father to deflect or make an excuse. But instead, he nodded and shifted forward in his chair, curious. Elias opened his files and began showing the photographs from his coastal erosion project. Images of cliffs crumbling into the sea, tide pools clinging to existence, beaches transformed by storms. He narrated each image, explaining what he was trying to capture, how the coast was changing, how fragile everything we loved actually was. My father looked at each photograph carefully, leaning closer to see the details. He asked questions, technical ones at first, about camera settings and timing, but then deeper ones about why Elias chose certain locations, what drew him to document loss and resilience. I sat there watching them, barely breathing, witnessing something I had never imagined possible. My father engaging with my husband's work, trying to understand the way he saw the world. At one point, Elias showed him a photograph of Cannon Beach at sunset, the same location where the photo in our wedding invitation had been taken. The light was golden, the rocks dark silhouettes against the water. My father stared at it for a long time. "That's beautiful," he said quietly. "You have a real gift." Elias thanked him, and I saw something pass between them. Not friendship exactly, but recognition. A beginning. I stepped outside for a moment, needing air, and stood on the porch looking out at the yard. The grass was still brown, winter-worn, but there were small signs of spring beginning. Buds on the trees, a few early crocuses pushing through the soil. I heard the door open behind me, and when I turned, I expected to see Elias. But it was my father. He came and stood beside me, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders hunched against the cold. We stood there in silence for a moment, and then he said, "He's good for you." "I can see that." I felt something break open in my chest. I told him yes, that Elias was the best thing that had ever happened to me. My father nodded slowly. "Your mother would have liked him," he said. "She would have liked seeing you this happy." It was such a simple thing to say, but it meant everything. It meant he saw us. It meant he was trying. When we went back inside, my father asked if we wanted to stay for dinner. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a quiet offer, but I knew what it cost him to ask. We stayed. We ate leftover stew that he had made earlier in the week, and we talked. About the weather, about Elias's photography, about my teaching, about nothing and everything. It was ordinary, and that ordinariness felt like grace. Over the following weeks, something shifted. My father started calling me occasionally, just to check in. The conversations were brief, still awkward in places, but they were real. He asked about my day, about Elias, about whether the rain in Portland was as bad as the news made it sound. They were small gestures, but they accumulated into something larger, a bridge being built slowly, carefully, one plank at a time. In March, I brought Elias with me again. This time, my father was waiting on the porch when we arrived, and he greeted Elias by name, asked him how his work was going. They sat together in the living room while I went to make coffee, and when I came back, I found them deep in conversation about boats. Elias was asking about the ships my father had worked on, and my father was explaining the mechanics, his hands moving as he described how engines worked, how hulls were repaired. I stood in the doorway holding the coffee mugs, watching my husband draw my father out of his silence with genuine curiosity and patience. And I realized that Elias was doing what he had always done, seeing the good in people, finding the humanity beneath the fear and pride. That afternoon, we sat together on the back porch, all three of us. My father had been coughing more, and I could see how it tired him. But he seemed content, wrapped in a blanket, watching the wind move through the trees. Elias excused himself to take a phone call, and my father and I sat alone. After a moment, he spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about your mother lately," he said. "About things she told me. Things I didn't understand at the time." I waited, sensing he had more to say. "She used to talk about living an honest life. About how much it cost to hide who you really were. I didn't know what she meant back then. I thought she was just being philosophical. But now I think." He stopped, his voice catching. "I think she was trying to tell me something about herself. Something she never got to fully live." I reached over and placed my hand on his arm. We sat there together, two people finally learning how to grieve the same loss. He looked at me then, his eyes wet. "I'm sorry I made you wait so long, Julian. I'm sorry I couldn't be brave when you needed me to be." I told him that I understood, that I was learning that forgiveness wasn't a single moment, but a series of small choices to keep showing up, to keep trying. He nodded, and we sat there until Elias returned. Then the three of us stayed on that porch, talking and sitting in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon fade into evening. In April, my father's condition worsened. The doctors said his lungs were deteriorating faster than they had hoped. He started using oxygen at night, then during the day. Nora and I began coordinating visits, making sure someone was checking on him regularly. One evening, I arrived to find him sitting in his chair, the oxygen tube in his nose, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen him. But when he saw me, he smiled, a real smile, unguarded, and asked me to sit with him. We talked about small things at first. Then he asked me about the wedding, about the ceremony he hadn't attended. He asked what it was like, standing there with Elias, making those promises. I told him it was the happiest and saddest day of my life. Happy because I was marrying the person I loved. Sad because he wasn't there. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I wish I could go back and do it differently. I wish I had been the father you deserve." I told him that he was being that father now, that it wasn't too late for this, for what we were building together in these final months. He reached over and took my hand, his grip weak but steady. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You make him happy, Julian. Elias, I see the way he looks at you, the way you look at him. That's all I ever wanted for you. I just didn't know how to say it." I knelt beside his chair and put my arms around him, carefully, mindful of the tubes and his fragility. And for the first time since I was a child, my father held me back. We stayed like that for a long time, both of us crying quietly, both of us finally letting go of all the years we had spent being afraid of this exact tenderness. When I left that night, driving back to Portland through the darkness, I called Elias and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said simply, "I'm proud of you. I'm proud of both of you." And I realized that what we had found wasn't redemption or reconciliation in any perfect sense. It was just two people, father and son, learning how to love each other honestly before it was too late. It was imperfect and incomplete, and more beautiful than anything I could have imagined. My father passed away in January, almost exactly a year after that first visit when everything had finally begun to change. It happened quietly, in his sleep, the way he had always said he wanted to go. Nora was the one who found him, and she called me early in the morning, her voice steady but broken beneath the surface. Elias held me while I cried, and then he helped me pack a bag. We drove to Astoria together through the rain, the windshield wipers keeping rhythm with my thoughts. All the things I wished I had said, all the moments we had reclaimed, all the time we had lost, and the small amount we had been given back. The funeral was small, just as he would have wanted. A handful of people from town, old co-workers from the shipyard, Nora and her family, Elias and me. We gathered at the small church near the water, rain drumming on the roof, and listened to a minister who had known my father only slightly talk about hard work and quiet dignity. Afterward, we stood in the cemetery on the hill overlooking the ocean, watching as they lowered his casket into the ground beside my mother's grave. The gulls circled overhead, their cries sharp against the wind. I held Elias's hand and thought about how my father had spent so many years unable to speak his heart, and how in the end, he had found the courage to try. That evening, Nora returned to Seattle, and Elias and I went back to the house one last time. We needed to begin sorting through my father's belongings, to decide what to keep and what to let go. The task felt enormous, not because there was so much, but because every object carried weight: his coffee mug, his reading glasses, the worn work boots by the door. I started in the living room while Elias worked in the kitchen. I went through drawers and cabinets, finding the accumulated debris of a life lived simply: old bills, photographs, receipts from years ago. And then I moved to the garage, the place where my father had spent so many hours, the place where I had once tried and failed to tell him who I was. The garage smelled of sawdust and oil, exactly as it always had. His workbench was covered with tools, each one in its designated place. And there, in the center of the bench, I found something that made me stop breathing. It was a wooden frame, unfinished but carefully constructed. The wood had been sanded smooth, the corners joined with precision. And inside it, held in place with small clips, was the photograph from our wedding invitation. Elias and me at Cannon Beach, smiling, the wind in our hair, our faces bright with happiness. My father had been framing it. I picked it up carefully, running my fingers over the grain of the wood, feeling where he had stopped mid-construction. I imagined him here, alone in this garage, working on this frame in the months before he died, taking his time, getting it right, creating something to hold the image of his son and the man his son loved. I stood there with tears streaming down my face, clutching this unfinished frame that said more than any words could. He had seen us. He had wanted to honor us. And even though he hadn't finished, even though he had run out of time, the intention was there. The love was there. Elias found me like that, standing in the garage with the frame in my hands. He came and stood beside me, his arm around my shoulders, and we looked at it together in silence. Later that night, back in Portland, I sat at my own workbench and completed what my father had started. I sanded the remaining rough edges, applied the finish, fitted the glass and backing. I worked slowly, carefully, thinking of his hands doing this same work, thinking of all the things he had built and repaired over his lifetime. When it was finished, Elias and I drove back to Astoria one more time. We let ourselves into the empty house. It would be sold soon, Nora and I had decided, and I carried the completed frame to the mantel. I placed it there beside the photograph of my mother, the two images side by side, past and present, loss and love, everything that had been broken and everything that had been mended. We stood there together, Elias and I, looking at those two photographs in the quiet house. Outside, we could hear the ocean breathing against the shore, steady and eternal, the same sound my father had listened to every night of his life. I thought about the empty chair at our wedding, about how much that absence had hurt, and I thought about all the moments that had come after, the late-night conversation on the porch, the afternoons spent together, the way my father had learned to see us, to accept us, to try. It hadn't been enough time. It would never have been enough time, but it had been something. Elias took my hand, and we walked out of that house together, closing the door gently behind us. We stood on the porch for a moment, looking out at the yard where spring was beginning to show itself, green pushing through the brown, life insisting on itself despite everything. I realized then that grief and love were not opposites. They were companions, inseparable, each one giving the other meaning. I would carry my father with me, not as a weight, but as a presence, flawed and human and finally, in his own way, brave. We drove back to Portland as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Elias drove while I sat in the passenger seat, watching the landscape pass by. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace, not the absence of pain, but the presence of acceptance. The understanding that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real. That forgiveness doesn't erase the hurt, but it makes room for something else to grow beside it. When we got home, Elias made tea and we sat together on the couch, my head on his shoulder, his hand in mine. We didn't need to talk about my father or the funeral or the frame I had completed. We just sat there in the quiet, holding each other, building the life we had promised to build, imperfect and honest and whole. And somewhere in the house by the sea, on a mantel beside a photograph of a woman who had never gotten to live her truth fully, there was an image of two men smiling at the camera, held in a frame built by hands that had learned, finally, how to construct something beautiful out of love.